Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Civic Signal. Today is the first part of a two video mini series that Sam and I will be doing about gerrymandering, which is a topic that's very prevalent in the news today. Today, we're going to discuss what is gerrymandering. And in the next video, we're going to look at some research that can help us inform our opinion on the lasting effects of gerrymandering.
So, like Brandon mentioned, we want to jump right in and ask the question, what is gerrymandering? But before we ask that question and answer it, we first have to look at the way that the Constitution sets up the systems of elections and specifically the House of Representatives. So, right out of the Constitution in Article 1, Section 2, it says, the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states. It goes on to say representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers. So ultimately, what this is getting at and what it elaborates on in later sections is that within the Congress, the House of Representatives is set up to be directly proportionate with the number of representatives coming from each state representing how many people live within that state. So I'm from Idaho. Idaho has the minimum number of representatives, which is two, because there's a very small population. But if you're from a state like Texas or California or New York, there's going to be a lot more representatives because there's a much higher population in those states.
So, because every state gets a number of representatives, we need to split the state up geographically into several districts, in which each district will elect a member to the House of Representatives. And this system is also the case for many states' state legislative bodies, where they'll cut up their state, not necessarily into the same districts as the congressional districts, but into other districts where they'll elect more local state leaders. But this map right here is a map of my home state, Massachusetts. Massachusetts has 9 representatives in the House of Representatives. So as you can see in this picture, Massachusetts is cut up into 9 congressional districts.
Now, the Constitution does not really give detailed instructions on how these maps are supposed to be drawn and how the elections are set up and operated within each state. Ultimately, what the Constitution does say is that there should be roughly equal population within each congressional district, and they should be contiguous, which just means like you can't have a circle on the west side and a circle on the east side of the state, and they're just half of the same district. It's got to be one block. And compact, it shouldn't be like a snake going through the whole thing, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And ultimately, there should be no racial discrimination. There have been several acts of Congress that have also elaborated on the instructions within the Constitution that direct the states to do or not do certain things or take certain things into consideration when creating these maps. But ultimately, within Article Section 1 of the Constitution, like we read earlier, in a later section, Section 4, it says that it's up to the states to determine how the elections are going to be run. So ultimately, that's a really messy business because some states are going to do things in what may be viewed as a more fair way. Some are going to be more partisan or more racially discriminatory. And so there's always a lot of lawsuits coming up. And so we're going to kind of look into the history of this idea of gerrymandering and what that looks like.
So when we talk about what is gerrymandering and the history of gerrymandering, there's a lot of people who will argue the Republicans started gerrymandering or the Democrats started gerrymandering. And in reality, gerrymandering is older than both of the parties. It dates all the way back to 1812 to this guy here, Elbridge Gerry. Now, Elbridge Gerry was one of the founding fathers. He signed the Declaration of Independence. But in 1812, he was the governor of Massachusetts and he was a member of the Democratic Republican Party. So if you remember back to our video about why America only has two parties, the Democratic Republican Party was in a two-party system with the Federalists at the time. And they were vying for political power against each other. So Elbridge Gerry, as the governor of Massachusetts, was part of the process of redrawing the districts in Massachusetts to elect members to the House of Representatives. And when he signed the new map into law, critics said that it included a district that was unfairly drawn because it was really weirdly shaped. And over here on the right, we have a picture, a cartoon of the district. This was in the Boston Gazette, and they make it look like this giant dragon, which they called a salamander. And so the district had the name Gerrymander, the Gerrymander District, making fun of Elbridge Gerry for being the one to sign it into law. And so that's where this term gerrymandering comes from, all the way back in 1812 with this gerrymander district.
So ultimately, the term gerrymandering has come to mean the drawing of electoral districts to give one political group an unfair advantage. And political group here broadly can be interpreted as a political party, but more specifically, those who are drawing these maps may draw it in such a way to adversely affect certain racial or ethnic groups or urban versus rural areas, which ultimately are going to give an unfair advantage to the party. But this could be broken up down into very individual, particular demographics within the state. So, one example of this that we've seen in recent years, and one of the most notorious example of this is North Carolina. So, North Carolina, we have here an example of just within the span of 2 years, four different congressional maps that were drawn and submitted. Now, interesting fact about North Carolina, they are the only state where the governor is prohibited from vetoing a congressional map passed by the legislature. So if the legislature passes it, then it's the law. But this leads to a lot of their maps being sent to the courts and to the North Carolina Supreme Court and to federal courts. Now, it's interesting to note that North Carolina, in the most recent presidential election, voted 51% for Trump, 48% for Harris. But as we look at the most recent Republican map, or the most recent map passed in 2023, which was upheld by the North Carolina Supreme Court, it gives a lot more of the districts to the Republican Party control.
So I think that this chart does a good job of explaining that this process of drawing maps can be really messy from state to state. And a lot of different states have a lot of different rules for how they draw their maps. So I think it's important to note partisanship plays like the ultimate role when it comes to drawing these maps. Some states will say that they have an independent commission that draws the maps, or they have a bipartisan committee drawing the maps. But really, when politicians are acting, it's primarily with election advantages in mind. And so I think it's very difficult to find a fair method of drawing the maps that's not influenced at all by party. So we're going to talk a little bit about the strategies, the famous strategies that people use when they draw these districts. The first strategy is what's called packing. And when you pack, when you're drawing districts, that means that you concentrate opposing voters into just a few districts that you intend to lose. That way, they waste a lot of votes winning a district, and then you can be competitive in all of the other ones. The opposite of packing when you're drawing districts is what's called cracking. And that's when you split the opposing vote into as many districts as you can in order to make it so that the opposing voters don't have a majority in any district. And this is a strategy that is used really often, but there's a drawback here where you risk making more districts competitive than you actually intended to, so that in a strong year, the opposing voters might be able to steal a vote that you originally intended them not to win. And that's what's called dummymandering, and that's happened to both parties throughout history, where they draw districts that they think they're going to win, but they accidentally make them more competitive than they intended.
So, one simple way to visualize this whole concept of districting, it's just a simple 5 by 10 grid with Republicans represented in red and Democrats represented in blue. And the idea here is you're supposed to draw five districts.
Here on our grid, 40% of these dots are Republican and 60% are Democratic voters. And they're distributed very nicely and uniformly geographically. So obviously this is an oversimplified example, but there's a lot of ways that you can gerrymander these districts to manipulate the outcome so they don't necessarily represent this 40% Republican and 60% Democrat.
The first example here, when you see 40% versus 60%, this is the intuitive answer would be there's two solidly Republican districts, there's three solidly Democratic districts. Within these districts, there's no competition, and every single person is electing their preferred candidate. Again, this is an oversimplified way to view it, but with the other examples, we can kind of see how this is helpful to start visualizing the packing versus cracking ideas in gerrymandering.
So the next way you can draw these districts would be fracking the Republicans. So as you can see here in each of the five districts, there are 6 Democrats and 4 Republicans, meaning that the Democrats are going to win every single district. So even though 40% of the voters are Republican and 60% are Democratic, the Democrats are going to have 100% of the districts, all five of them.
Now, you can also see how in this example, it would be very easy. All it would take would be for one Democratic voter to change to be a Republican, and then all of a sudden it's a 50-50 toss up. So this is why this can get a little bit dicey and things can get off base from the initial partisan strategies developed. In this example here, we have the Republicans presumably would be the ones drawing this district, and they are packing the Democrats, or they're giving the Democrats two throwaway freebie districts there at the bottom so that they can divide their vote in those top three districts to take control of 60% of the districts with only 40% of the vote.
So as you can see, there's a lot of different ways that you can draw districts to manipulate the results of the elections. There's this phrase that is commonly thrown around when gerrymandering is discussed, and that's that politicians are choosing their voters rather than voters are choosing their politicians. And you can kind of see that in effect here, where when you draw the lines, you're choosing who votes for who votes in what election, and you can manipulate it to give your party an unfair advantage.
As we've looked at some of the history and some of the strategies that goes into gerrymandering, there's a lot of other questions that we have, which is how much does this actually affect election outcomes, both for the House of Representatives and for state representative seats? How much does this impact the ways that people are engaged politically? Are people sitting on the sidelines because they don't feel represented? There's a lot of other questions that we could ask as well. And so Brandon and I decided to split this up into a 2-part series where today we discussed just the concept of gerrymandering. And then we're going to release a second video where we look at some of the political science research that's gone into looking into the issue of gerrymandering and specifically the longevity of these effects. How serious is this for a long time? And what does that mean if redistricting happens frequently versus infrequently?
So thank you for joining us today. Keep on the lookout for that next video. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss all of our future videos. Leave a thumbs up and a comment. We'd love to hear what you guys have to say on this topic. And we'll catch you in the next one.
Now, one thing that I thought was interesting, if you want to pull up those North Carolina maps, the big story here that we're missing is they sunk the Outer Banks off the coast of North Carolina. If you look in the first couple maps, over on the east side, you have the Outer Banks, and then they're gone later. So I don't know if
Yeah,
that's happened. That's unfortunate if they got rid of those, but
that's an extreme strategy when it comes to gerrymandering.